My name is Emily Lopper, and this is my personal theory presentation. So I feel that I'm pretty aware of my personal theory. Just a few months after graduating from undergrad, I became a child welfare caseworker, and given that I'm new to the role, new to the field, and new to the professional world in general, and then I also possess a role that can be at times very, very challenging, I feel like I'm constantly thinking about and assessing my personal theory, and it's pretty important that I do so in order to have the most productive interactions with my clients. And one example that I think of in how my personal theory is evaluated in my professional role is when I'm dealing with difficult clients. As a child welfare caseworker, it's pretty often that I'm met with resistance, frustration, fear from my clients, and in these circumstances, it's especially important that I'm intentional about my interactions with them, and I do so by evaluating myself. So, it can be easy to say, oh, this client is quote unquote just being difficult, but I have to take a step back and evaluate myself. Is there somewhere I went wrong? Is there something that I said or did that might have triggered this resistance or this disengagement? And what can I do to make it better? And then, on the other hand, also taking the time to reflect on positive interactions that I had with clients. I feel like this conversation went really well, or I feel like this action that I had to take against them went really well. What techniques and approaches that I use that I can apply to future clients to continue to make sure that my clients feel supported and that I'm still maintaining my own personal values. And then, of course, I have to follow New York State laws and regulations. I have to follow agency protocols, and those don't necessarily always fully align with my beliefs or my preferred courses of action. But, in my role, of course, my personal values and beliefs can never take precedent over the family's safety, which at times can be difficult. And there are times that I have to have conversations with clients or take certain actions against clients, such as, maybe legal action that, according to my own value system, don't feel the greatest, but I try to, to combat this, I kind of try to always make sure that even if it's not what I want to do, every action that I'm taking and every conversation that I have with my clients, I'm not having or doing for any reason other than truly believing it will be in their best interest, even if it's not in that moment, but in the end. And I do think that people can change, obviously given the role that I have, that is something that that's a way of thinking that I kind of always have to maintain, but it's often very difficult to maintain that, because I see a lot of, time and time again, change not being made, and that can be very frustrating. So I think that people can change, but I also think that change is more difficult for some than it is for others, and obviously can look vastly different for everyone. And I think both external and internal factors contribute to change. And I think one prime example of this is substance use disorder. So, I work with a lot of people who struggle with substance use disorder, and you can tell them, hey, if you don't go to rehab, you risk having your child removed from your care, or, hey, you're experiencing this, and this because of your substance use. And all of those external factors and those external experiences, lead them to experience further hardship, and those might contribute to the kind of internal spark that happens from within that eventually sparks the change. But those external factors alone aren't what's going to make the person decide to make that change. And then I also think that personality traits begin as inherent, but whether and how they change is learned. So many of our personality traits come from what we observe and are taught by our parents, but as we age, we begin to have our own experiences, develop our own schemas about the world, and eventually develop our own personality. So, we may, as adults, be told, you are so much like your mom. I'm told that all the time, but I also have a lot of personality traits that are vastly different than those of my mother's. So that's kind of where that comes into play. And, certain personality traits are distinguished by behavior, although sometimes it's not always obvious. And it also looks different for everyone. So, we all have the same definition, for example, of creative. But someone who may be described as creative because they make beautiful and unique pieces of art, you know, another person might be described as creative because they come up with unique Christmas gift ideas. So the definition of creative doesn't necessarily change there, it's just manifesting in a different way. And then I do believe that human beings are inherently good, and whether they remain good is dependent on the experiences that they have throughout their lives, and the things that they are taught by people like I mentioned before, their parents. And I believe that most people who are described as quote-unquote bad aren't necessarily bad people, they've just made bad choices. And I think it's so easy for us to say they're a bad person because they've made a lot of bad choices, but that's not necessarily true. And the bad choices that they've made are likely because of trauma that they have experienced at some point in their lives. And I also think that humans are both controlling and controlled. I think that it is almost human instinct to be controlling because everyone wants to be able to decide what happens to them. However, there are certain situations in which the ability to control is limited, such as, you know, the government, the workplace, and in relationships. You know, there are kind of limitations and boundaries that have to be set with how much controlling you can do.